So what is GKE Autopilot?
Absolutely awesome.
It is the only service of that kind.
As far as I know, nobody else does that.
You already have a Kubernetes cluster, or you are planning to have a Kubernetes cluster. And one of the questions you might be asking yourself, what is the level of control I want to have on top of that Kubernetes cluster? Do I want to install it from scratch? Do I want to use one of the existing Kubernetes platforms or distributions? Do I want to let somebody else manage my Kubernetes cluster? And if I do, what is the level of control I will give to somebody else? And what is the level I want to retain to myself? So those are the questions you might be asking, and it all boils down to a simple one. What is the level of control you should have of your Kubernetes clusters? Do you want full control, meaning that you control absolutely everything? Then you start from scratch. You create your own virtual machines or bare metal servers. You install the OS. Even better, you compile the OS yourself, install it on top of all the nodes, control plane and worker nodes. You use kubeadm to install some of the things you need, and then on top of that you install some other things, and you join them together into a coherent group, and you start calling it a cluster. And then you go for the second, the third, the fourth one, and you do it all by yourself. That is silly. That is so silly. There is a group of people, tiny group of people, minuscule group of people who really know what they're doing, and they're doing all those things. And there is a much bigger group of people who think that they know what they're doing, but they don't. And then they run into trouble because doing everything you need to do from scratch without any additional tools, without any platform, without using services from others is hard, and it requires a very deep knowledge into many different things. What is the alternative to that? You can use an existing Kubernetes platform like Rancher or OpenShift or what's not, many of them. And then you do more or less the same as in the previous case, but some of the things are simplified because those platforms come already with the tools you need, opinionated and what's not. But that is also silly unless you have to be on-prem. If you have to be on-prem, then there's not much you can do beyond choosing something like Rancher, OpenShift, and suffering a lot in the process. A much better option is to have a managed Kubernetes cluster. You can choose AWS EKS, Azure AKS, Google GKE, Alibaba something, Linode, DigitalOcean. They all have managed Kubernetes clusters. But the problem is that they are not really fully managed. None of them is really managed completely. If you're lucky, you get managed control plane. If you're a bit luckier, you get some semblance of managed nodes, but still you need to manage that stuff one way or another. Maybe not the control plane, that's a norm more or less, but worker nodes, hey, that's your job, you need to manage it yourself. Cloud providers like Azure, AWS, Alibaba, what else, Google, and so on and so forth, will not manage everything there is to be managed. You still need to figure out what will be the size of your nodes, what will be the operating system potentially sometimes, how it will scale, what is the minimum number of replicas, maximum number of replicas, and so on and so forth. You need to do a lot of stuff, much less than if you install it completely by yourself, but still a lot of things, and there is a big chance that you're going to mess it up. It happens. It's almost unavoidable because there are very few teams in the world who have really deep experience how to do that stuff. And you can gain that experience as well. Everybody can learn everything there is to be learned about something, but why would you? Unfortunately, there is no cloud provider that gives you fully managed Kubernetes cluster. Actually, that is not true. Since the end of February, beginning of March 2021, there is one provider that gives you fully managed Kubernetes cluster. No exception. Everything fully managed by somebody else. All you would have to do is run your applications. And that somebody is Google, and the offering is called GKE Autopilot or Google Kubernetes Engine Autopilot. So what is GKE Autopilot? One way to describe it would be that GKE Autopilot is a fully managed Kubernetes as a service based on best practices and battle hardened by Google SREs. And those guys know what they're doing. They're not the only guys who know what they're doing, but they know what they're doing. And they wrapped their best practices, they wrapped their experience in managing Kubernetes into a service that you can use. But you cannot do anything you want in such a cluster, which I will show you soon. It is restricted. There are certain rules that need to be followed, and there are certain restrictions. For example, external IP services are blocked. CapNet row is disabled. Host path volumes are not allowed unless it is /var/logs and only in read mode. There is no ability to run privileged pods. And there are many other things that you cannot do because you shouldn't. Now you might be saying, hey, I do not know what those things are. Great, then brilliant. There is no problem for you, because if you don't know what they are, you're probably not even using them. And if you know what they are, really, then you probably know that you shouldn't be using the things that are not allowed. I mean, the full list you can go to the site to see, but there are certain restrictions, and they're for good. Like, hey, you cannot do privileged mode. Of course you cannot do privileged mode. You shouldn't be able to do privileged mode. And now with Autopilot, that is not allowed. Brilliant, right? That's implementation of best practices. We are not allowed anymore to do things that we shouldn't be doing in the first place. That was enough of an intro. I will comment on quite a few other features related to Autopilot through a hands-on demo. So let's explore GKE Autopilot in 20 minutes or less. And for that, I will need to start by creating a completely new cluster.
Here we are. This is Google Cloud Console, and I will use it to demonstrate how Autopilot works. Normally, I would script everything or run it through CLI or maybe Terraform or something like that. But I believe that since this is so new, it will be easier to understand what's going on through the console. So I will go to Kubernetes Engine and I will do the normal stuff like, hey, let me create a new cluster. But before I do that, I need to enable the API. So fast forwarding. There we are. The API is enabled, and now I can really create a cluster. So let's click the create button, and this is a new thing, right? Until recently, we could only create the standard cluster. We were not even asked which type of cluster we want to create. And now we have the option to create Autopilot cluster. So let's click the configure button. And let's see what we'll get. What are the options? What can we specify? Okay, so we can select the region. Cool. We can name the cluster. Let me name it GKE Autopilot Demo. You probably noticed something curious. There is almost nothing we can specify. There are a few networking options, nothing really fancy, few advanced options. Again, not much over there. And what is definitely missing here, the big thing, is that we cannot specify the nodes. I cannot set how many nodes I have, whether it will auto-scale or not, what will be the size of the nodes, or operating system, none of those things. Essentially, we can only say, hey, I want a cluster that is going to be called like this, and I want it to be in this region. So region and the name is all we can set. There are a few other options, but basically only the region is what matters. And the only thing we can do with such a small number of options is click the create button. And now I'm fast forwarding again. It will take probably 5 to 6 minutes until it's up and running. So while waiting, it is important that I repeat this one more time. The standard GKE cluster manages the control plane, and we manage the nodes. Now, of course, Google helps us in managing those nodes, but it is still our responsibility to choose how many nodes we want, whether they will scale automatically or not, what is the size and what's not. With the Autopilot, we just say, hey, I want a cluster. I don't care about nodes, that's not my problem. And the pricing model is in line with that. We will be paying only for the resources that our pods consume. Whether Google will create 1 node, 1,000 nodes, how big they will be, and all those things are irrelevant. We pay only for the resources our pods are consuming. And that's awesome. That is a true container as a service, or at least a variation of containers as a service. It's not even Kubernetes anymore. We are just specifying where we want our pods to run, and we'll pay for the pods that are running. What will be the infrastructure below all that is Google's problem. Whether it will create large nodes, big nodes, whether it will waste resources or not, again, Google's problem. Our problem is to create pods, to specify what we want to run and run those things without really thinking about the cluster. And we can see that by examining the SLA while waiting for those things to happen, for my cluster to be created. So here is the SLA. Look at this. If it is a zonal cluster, we get 99.5% availability, guaranteed availability, for the control plane only for the control plane. What happens with the nodes is not part of the SLA. Same thing for the regional cluster. Slightly higher uptime, guaranteed uptime, 99.95, but only for the control plane. Now, when we move into the autopilot, we get 99.95% uptime guaranteed for the control plane, but this is a new thing. This is awesome. Autopilot pods in multiple zones. So as long as we run our pods in a regional cluster across multiple zones, we get 99.9 uptime guarantee, SLA, for our pods. It's not anymore SLA for the cluster, it's for the pods. Google guarantees that our pods will be running. Of course, that does not apply to bugs of your applications, if your processes are not working correctly and what's not. But if everything is okay on your side, Google guarantees 99.9 uptime SLA for our pods. Nobody, as far as I know, nobody else does that. Nobody else has that type of SLA that they guarantee our apps are running, not the control plane, not some underlying infrastructure, our applications. Pods, and pods are our applications. Now we can go into details of what else we have in SLA. It's a long document, read it. I will provide the link in the gist and in the description. So go to the description, you will find the gist with the commands that I will run later and all the links you need. Now let's go back to the cluster, see whether it is up and running. It's not, so fast forwarding to the end of the process. There we are, the cluster was created. So let's go inside, and there is not much to see, right? If you're familiar with GKE, you probably know that there is a tab saying nodes. No, we cannot see the nodes. We can only see that nodes might be running in one of those zones, which are zones of the region that we selected, and that's about it. There is no way to specify the nodes, and many of the options that we traditionally have are locked because Google now guarantees that things are running for us. So let me connect to the cluster. I will go to the connect button and I will copy this command, and that command will create kubeconfig. So let's see what we'll get. So we'll export kubeconfig variable to be the current directory wherever I am right now, config.yaml, and I will execute the command that will create my Kubernetes config. There we are, right? Now I can deploy an application, for example, by doing cut kts.yaml. This is the simplest application. I want to see what is going on now. How does the application behave? So I'm going with something fairly simple, and that is a single deployment. There we are, single deployment based on an existing image. Now the important part here is that I'm specifying limits, CPU and memory, and resources, requested resources, also CPU and memory. And below that, I'm specifying horizontal pod autoscaler that will scale my deployment, scale the number of pods of that deployment based on average utilization of memory. Whenever memory reaches 25%, it will scale up. I specified it because this application that I will deploy will be increasing the usage of memory. So I created a small demo app that will be increasing memory utilization. That way I can simulate what happens with the app from the scaling perspective, and HPA will scale it whenever memory utilization reaches 25%. So I want to force that scaling functionality that is baked in and see what's happening with nodes and what's not. So let's apply this. kubectl apply -- file name ktest.yaml and go. I said go. There we are. Let's watch what's happening by executing kubectl get pods and nodes. And we can see that there are 2 pods already because that's the minimum for my HPA. they're about to be created. And we can see that Google created 2 nodes in that cluster. Generally speaking, even though that's not hard rule that cannot be avoided, but more often than not, Google will create 1 node for each pod. There might be an extra node for some system level resources, what's or not, but that does not matter because we do not really care about the number of nodes. Here it's Google's responsibility to create nodes and destroy nodes. So we have 2 that are doing some random stuff, not really important, and 2 that are being created right now. And why are we getting 2 nodes? Simply because there are 2 pods that should be running. So Google is creating 1 node for each pod. And the size of that node will be appropriate for the specified amount of resources, or if there are no resources specified, it will try to figure it out. By default, GKE will assume that your pod is using half a CPU and 2 gigabytes of memory by default. Now, if we specify resources ourselves, then it will use that information to figure out how it should run stuff and where it should run and what's not. Anyways, we have 2 pods running and 4 nodes, 2 nodes doing some random stuff. We don't care because we are not paying for that stuff. We are paying only for our pods, and 2 nodes because there are 2 pods, 2 replicas of that deployment. Now, the memory usage of that application in those pods is increasing over time. I designed the app to do that, to basically simulate memory leaks, and soon it will scale up. So let me fast forward a bit until it scales up and see what's going on. There we are. Memory usage increased over 25% because that's what I specified in HPA, in horizontal pod autoscaler. And the HPA scaled the application to 3 replicas, and now it scaled it to 4 replicas. It is, as I said before, it is simulating memory leaks, and 2 of those are pending, and soon you will see Google will react. It will create new nodes to host those additional pods, so it will scale up. Now it's scaled even more. We can see that now it's scaled to 6 replicas. That's the maximum number of replicas I allow in horizontal pod autoscaler. And we got a new node, the first new node, and now yet another node is being created to accommodate the need to have more replicas. And it keeps following the pattern of having 1 node for every pod. And so on and so forth. It will create the 5th and the 6th and the 7th and the 8th node, and then it will scale down if the number of pods drops, and so on and so forth. It will do whatever needs to be done, and we do not care about any of those things. The only thing we should care about is to define our applications and run them in Kubernetes. And Google is taking full responsibility for everything related to infrastructure and Kubernetes itself, and making sure that our pods are almost always running, right? They might be in a pending state for a few seconds, when it scales up until nodes are created, if there is a need to create nodes. But outside that, it's all Google's responsibility, and we can focus only on deploying our applications. And that is absolutely awesome. Actually, let's go back to the big screen, my head in full glory, and talk about this. What do I think about this? What's going on? What is this new service?
We could have a long debate where we would argue whether Google Cloud is better or worse than AWS or Azure, which one is better, which one better suits your needs, and so on and so forth. But when Kubernetes is concerned, it's almost undisputable that GKE, the standard one, the normal one, the one that existed for years now, is the best Kubernetes service there is in the market. Google nailed Kubernetes. And now with Autopilot, there is absolutely no discussion anymore. Google is ahead of everyone when Kubernetes is concerned. Now, Kubernetes is not everything everybody uses, so that does not mean in any form of way that Google is better or worse than AWS or Azure in general terms. But Autopilot proves that there is no better place to run Kubernetes than in Google Cloud. If you want more control, use GKE standard. If you want a fully managed Kubernetes as a service solution, use Autopilot. If all you need is Kubernetes, there is no doubt Google nails it. Google is ahead of everyone by a big margin when Kubernetes is concerned. With GKE Autopilot entering the market and being just released, as I said before, February or March 2021, we have an option to stop worrying about our cluster and focus on what matters, and that's our applications. If we do not want to think about how we deploy our applications, we can use Google Cloud Run. Hey, if you're not familiar with Google Cloud Run, there is a video above my head. But if we do want to have control, but control over our applications and not everything else, if we do not care about infrastructure, if we want somebody else to make sure that everything is up and running and we focus on how we define and deploy our applications, GKE Autopilot is arguably the best solution we can have today. Actually, it is the only fully managed Kubernetes offer that we have, at least as far as I know. Other providers are getting there. They're partly managed, not managed at all. They give you different levels of control, but nobody gives you a fully managed Kubernetes cluster except Google with GKE Autopilot. Now, I understand that for some of you, having more control over your cluster, selecting the things like the size of the nodes and the way how it scales might be important, but for majority of us it's not. For majority of us, we want to focus on our applications and let somebody else manage everything else. And that something is Autopilot. And it's not that it is the best service of that kind, because it is, but it is the only service of that kind. Nobody else gives you such fully managed Kubernetes service. There is not much more to say about it except go and try it out. Now, truth be told, Google just released this, or maybe it didn't, depends on when you watch this video. But if you're watching this video in, let's say, first half of 2021, then you can say, hey, Google just released this. Maybe it's not as good, as stable as it should be. Maybe we need a bit more time. That would be a valid argument. From what I've seen, it works like a charm. But then again, I didn't go through all the possible use cases somebody might have. Try it out right away. Don't wait to try it out. If you can run things in Google Cloud, if you cannot, then I'm sorry. But if you have GCP account, try it out right away and then make a decision whether to use it immediately, wait for a while or not at all. But in the worst case scenario, everybody should try it out. Autopilot is, in my opinion, the best way to run our applications in Kubernetes without worrying about Kubernetes much, unless we have special requirements, special needs. Now, I know that many of you will say, hey, I have a special need. We all think that we are special, but in reality, there is a very small percentage of companies who have those really special needs. Just don't tell me that your special need is to run privileged pods or something like that, because that's not special, that's silly. Anyways, try it out. Please let me know in the comments what you think. Also, keep suggesting what I should explore. This video came as one of the suggestions. The video coming after this one is also based on your suggestions. As long as you keep suggesting what I should explore, I will keep exploring the things you suggested. See you next time, and hey, remember, hit the bell icon, subscribe, turn on the notifications, do all the stuff that you do, especially like it now. Goodbye, see you next time, cheers.